Hey, so one thing that I thought would be fun to do would be, instead of just uploading a jazzified version of a song, would be to upload this video where I kind of talk about the jazzification process, about what it looks like to me when I go about jazzifying a song, like the steps I take and what goes through my mind. Now, if you talk to different jazz musicians, you'll probably hear different things as to how they like to go about jazzifying a song, if they're into jazzifying non-jazz songs, but at least I can give you my perspective on it, and hopefully by the end of this you'll have a greater appreciation for what you may hear or don't hear when you hear jazzified versions of songs, at least versions that I upload, right? And I also think it would be kind of fun to have a video where, instead of just me getting filmed from the side, I can like talk directly at you guys, so I think it's a nice change of pace for that too. But jumping right into the subject, when I kind of go about jazzifying a song, for me what it starts with is an awareness of those core characteristics of jazz, those elements of jazz that have been consistent in the genre of music across the decades, across all the different subgenres that jazz has taken the form of. And so to me, there are 6 core characteristics of jazz. These 6 core characteristics, I view them as core characteristics because to me I've seen them as consistently being present across all the different subgenres of jazz, across all the different decades it's been around in American culture. And what those 6 core characteristics are is, first, and these are in no particular order, and I should say up front that these 6 characteristics, depending on the subgenre, will be present in that subgenre of jazz to varying degrees. So maybe one subgenre of jazz will have more of one characteristic and less of another, and so on and so forth. But those 6 core characteristics to me are, first, extended chords. In jazz, you rarely see chords smaller than a seventh. Pretty much all chords are at least sevenths. Oftentimes the chords are extended past that. They're ninths, 11ths, 13ths, so on and so forth. And that kind of gives the music kind of a slight dissonant tinge to it, the extended chords. Now, the second characteristic is syncopation. Syncopation is that it's kind of that rhythm, that kind of back and forth rhythm you hear it in like ragtime music, kind of like in bluesy music. That kind of rhythm, that syncopated rhythm's there in jazz. Another characteristic is changing keys. Jazz often changes keys. In fact, in most jazz pieces, you're changing keys like every few chords. Sometimes every chord is a different key. Another characteristic is dissonance. Now, this is one that really kind of runs the gambit from free jazz, which is very dissonant, to like the original, more like Dixie, Chicago jazz, not quite as dissonant. Bebop's kind of there in the middle, a little bit more towards the dissonant end. But that's been characteristic in all the different subgenres and eras of jazz, partly because extended chords add a certain level of dissonance, which we can kind of talk about later on. But another core element would be soloing. Now, soloing did kind of come in at the end of the Dixie era, like towards the tail end with Louis Armstrong and all that. But it was there, it was present at the end of the original first era of jazz, but it was there, and then it's been a mainstay ever since. Another characteristic would be improvisation / reharmonization. In jazz, you frequently, and this kind of goes with the soloing, right? Because soloing musicians are improvising oftentimes over the chords, but you also have that improv, you have that reharmonization where these jazz musicians are taking the chords that are written and they're reharmonizing, they're changing, they're tweaking the chords to give it their own unique spin. And so those 6 characteristics, those 6 principles, I would say, are core elements to jazz: extended chords, syncopation, changing keys, dissonance, soloing, and improvisation / reharmonization. These next 2 are like softer characteristics. One is instrumentation. There have just been a variety of instruments that are associated with the genre of music, such as the keyboard, the guitar, drums, trumpet, saxophone, so on and so forth. And the last kind of softer core characteristic is just the jazz mindset, the jazz philosophy of pushing boundaries, of doing things with music that hasn't been done before, pushing the edges of dissonance, pushing the edges of what's acceptable, of what's mainstream. And what's kind of fun with jazz is that you kind of look at the history of jazz and what was once pushing the boundaries has become very much within the boundaries of at least jazz as time has gone on. And even if you look at the last 20 or so years, without going into too much detail, at least for me, I kind of see different jazzy principles kind of infected genres of music and infiltrated genres of music beyond jazz itself, so that jazzy philosophy, that jazzy mindset of pushing boundaries, of doing new things, that's been characteristic of the genre of music. It's also one that's been there consistently throughout. So after being aware, after being cognizant of those core jazz characteristics, especially those 6 main ones, when I go around to jazzifying a song, usually the dialogue in my brain is which of those core jazz characteristics, which of those jazz elements do I want to incorporate into this song and why? And usually when I'm like jazzifying like contemporary pop songs, pop country songs, whatever it may be, usually the elements that I like to incorporate are the extended chords, the soloing, and the dissonance. Those are the 3 ones I usually like to incorporate. So I'll like turn all the chords into at least 7th versions of themselves. So major chords will become major 7ths, minor chords will become minor 7ths, so on and so forth. And I'll use it as an example, the song A Whole New World from Aladdin. Right here I'll be playing in the key of C's, the chords I'll be playing from. And I'll just play the regular version real quick, like the first verse. I can show you the world, shining, shimmering, splendid. Tell me, princess, now when did you last let your heart decide? So that's kind of like the version that's just standard as written, not jazzified at all. Now if I was to come to this piece and like, oh, I want to jazzify it a little bit, the first thing I do, usually I just extend all the chords. So I'll turn all the chords into 7ths, so this C major chord will become a C major 7th. It'll be like this. The F major will become an F major 7th. D minor will become a D minor 7th. And what this does, what the extended chords does, kind of tying into the dissonance that I like to add into pieces, is extended chords often they can sneakily bring in a tinge of dissonance. For example, you get your C major chord, right? It's very consonant. But the 7th, you play a 7th, C to B, it's very dissonant. But when you play a C major 7th, what you're doing is you're combining that dissonant 7th with the very consonant C major chord. And so this becomes this, and you kind of hear that subtle dissonance that's kind of sneaked in. So I like to incorporate extended chords. It kind of sneaks in that certain level of dissonance you kind of expect from jazz. And I'll play you a version of that first verse where I kind of extend all the chords. I can show you the world, shining, shimmering, splendid. Tell me, princess, now when did you last let your heart decide? So you can kind of hear right there, it's a little bit more dissonant because the chords have been extended. The other characteristic I like to incorporate is, well, I've said it a lot, dissonance, but usually what I mean by that is not just dissonance from extending chords, but incorporate more dissonance by like tweaking the chords, kind of like reharmonizing the chords a little bit. So maybe instead of playing a C major 7th, I'll play a Lydian version. I'll drop the 5th a half step, and I'll raise the 4th a half step. And instead of playing this, I'll play this. So kind of like it adds that extra level of dissonance in. Or maybe instead of playing a minor 7th, I'll play a minor major 7th. So instead of this, it'll be like this. So just kind of things like that. Kind of reharmonize the chords a little bit, tweak them a little bit, add in that extra level of dissonance. And finally, the last thing I usually like to incorporate when I'm jazzifying songs is soloing. Usually bluesy soloing because I just like the blues. So I usually find a place to add a bluesy solo in, probably in between a verse and another verse, or a verse and a chorus. I'll play the end of the first verse and kind of show you what I'm talking about. Now, when did you last let your heart decide? right there, I just kind of did a little run in A blues since I'm playing in the key of C. And now if I was actually trying to record it or play it for real, I would improve the timing. But just for the sake of example, it's kind of what I do. Finish the verse, throw in that solo, jump to the next verse. Here, let me do a version where I actually jump to the next verse. Now when did you last let your heart decide? I can open your eyes, take you wonder by wonder. So right there, end of the first verse, bluesy solo, into the next verse. Kind of like to add those things in there, find spots to kind of throw them in there. I like to think it gives it that, also an extra measure of jazziness to it. And I would say those are the three main elements of jazz, those three main core jazzy elements that I like to incorporate into like contemporary songs. I'm trying to jazzify them. And the reason for this is because the challenge with jazzifying non-jazz songs is you got to strike that balance between keeping the song recognizable to people that are used to hearing the normal version and also giving just enough jazzy characteristics that it has a jazzy vibe. So I don't usually syncopate the song because I think it'll kind of make it too unrecognizable. I don't usually incorporate a lot of key changes for the same reason. And the reharmonization I like to keep to kind of just that level that I was talking about, like maybe playing Lydian chords or minor major sevenths, but nothing really too crazy, nothing really too out there. That, at least to me, is the way I like to strike that balance between recognizable and still jazzy. And that's pretty much the way I go about it. Awareness of those 6 core jazz elements: extended chords, syncopation, dissonance, changing keys, soloing, and improv / reharmonization. I have that awareness of those 6 core elements, and then from there I usually choose which to incorporate into the song. Usually it ends up being extended chords, dissonance, and soloing with some slight reharmonization in there. And just kind of from there striking that balance between the piece still being recognizable, but at the same time giving it a jazzy flair to it. And you talk to other jazz musicians, I'm sure they'll tell you different ways they like to go about it, but at least for me, that's the kind of way that I like to go about it. And if you have any questions, or maybe you have different views or different opinions as to what you like to incorporate when jazzifying a song, or maybe you just want to talk about the subject in general, feel free to drop a comment. I love talking about jazz theory. I absolutely love the genre. So thanks for watching this. If you watch it all the way through, have a good one, okay?